I have been watching a lot of players strive to play GTO. They want to play good, strong GTO poker. They're doing their absolute best, sometimes well, sometimes not so well. And especially in tournaments like the World Series of Poker that attract a whole lot of somewhat novice players, especially in the $800 tournaments or the $1,500 tournaments. I mean, while you should make sure you understand good, strong GTO principles, you are going to want to make a point to exploit whatever your opponents do incorrectly. And when you get together more than 400 or so poker players, any amount more than 400 players usually results in a lot of those players not playing especially well. And I mean, look, I have been playing mostly $10,000 buy-in higher tournaments for the last 5 or 6 years, and I've not played a ton in the $800 buy-in tournaments. This is actually the first year at the World Series I have played anything smaller than, I think, a $3,000 buy-in tournament since COVID happened. And that's just because I've been out there a little bit longer and I'm trying to put in a little bit more volume since my kids are getting a little bit older and I'm focusing more on playing poker. And I mean, people are making mistakes left and right. And look, I feel like I have a pretty good handle on how to get in there and maximally exploit opponents. But I mean, since the advent of solvers and the fact that they become easier and easier to get access to, I think a lot of players are leaving a ton of money on the table by just trying to do what the solver says. And I mean, while you should do what the solver says against good, strong players or when you don't know what your opponent's doing incorrectly, you can make some assumptions about the broad player pool, especially live poker players in $800 buy-in tournaments when there's 3,000 people in the field. So in this video, I'm going to go through 5 things that I think you need to be doing to exploit the players in large field tournaments. And these exploits apply to large field tournaments, but they also apply to when the games are just not overly tough. So if you're playing a local $200 buy-in poker tournament that has 70 people and your opponents are not great, I mean, they're the players who go and play the $800 tournament at the World Series, and that's like their big game of the year. I mean, these exploits are going to apply too. So, number 1, you're going to want to make a point to overfold against river bets, just in general, especially as the river bets get bigger and bigger. Most players do not bet the river often enough as a bluff. This is especially true when there are not a lot of draws that have missed. So say the flop comes, whatever, ace, queen, 9, 6, 2. And that's a spot. In that spot, if your opponent bets the flop and the turn and the river, sure, they could have the king 10, the king jack, or the jack 10 for the bad end of the busted gut shot. Well, the busted gut shot. But they probably don't. They probably just have an ace and they're just going for a lot of value, right? So that's a scenario where if you do have a queen or even a bad ace, say you have ace with the worst kicker, if your opponent bets the flop and the turn and the river, you probably want to fold. In GTO world, if you get top pair with any kicker and there's various draws available, like all the logical Broadway gut shots, you're not really trying to fold. You're probably just going to call down and call it a cooler. But if your opponent's not going to be value betting with anything worse than top pair, as they often won't, and they'll think maybe king high has showdown value, or they will never bluff with random suited connectors that turn to backdoor flush draw or turn to gut shot or something like that, you just need to get out of the way, right? So you should be folding with your bluff catchers. Now, it is important to realize that a bluff catcher is a hand that loses to all of the value bets. So say the flop is something like ace, queen, 6, 9, 2. Ace jack is not really a bluff catcher because your opponent could be value betting ace 10 or ace X, right? I think a lot of people get in their minds they should be folding anything except for really good hands, like 2 pair or better. And that's probably not going to be the case because a lot of your opponents will take a hand like ace 10 or ace 8, whatever, ace with a medium kicker, and value bet it. So ace jack beats all the bluffs, although there aren't going to be that many, or there will at least be fewer than normal, but it also does beat some value bets. So definitely keep that in mind. But yeah, hands like middle pair are just trivially easy folds. Whereas if your opponent's known to be overly loose, aggressive, splashy, battly, as they sometimes are in the highest stakes games, or as particular opponents may be in these games, then you need to call much wider because they'll find all the potential bluffs and maybe then even a few more. Obviously, you need to always consider what your specific opponent does wrong, not only the player pool in general. At the World Series so far this last week, I had two particular spots that I'm thinking of off the top of my head where I could just look at my opponent and tell they were going to try to bluff the pro at the table, Jonathan Little, in the $800 buy-in tournament or whatever it was. And once I had ace high, I fully planned on calling down. I check call the flop. I check call the turn, and the river top pair, and they let it go check, check. If they bet the river, I was going to call with the ace high, and I was going to be pretty sure that they were bluffing a large chunk of the time. You can just look and tell that they're going to try to get after it and try to put a play on you sometimes. Another one of the times, the opponent, it's actually an interesting spot. A lady came to our table. She had a giant muscly man behind her who was like watching her. Maybe it was her boyfriend or something. And she sits down. She's like immediately staring me down. Me of all the people at the table. I'm just sitting there minding my own business, right? Try to not give any attention to people who are clearly staring me down for whatever reason. And I think I raised ace 10 offsuit. And she called in the big blind. And the flop came ace 9-2, 3 spades. I had no spade. She checked. I bet. She immediately raised. I think she checked. I bet 15,000. She immediately made it 40. All right. This is like third hand of the table for her. I called. Turn was 6, ace 9-2, 6. She checked. I bet small. She immediately called. Okay. The river was something like another 6, and she immediately led for all of her chips except for one big blind. Actually, maybe 2 or 3 big blinds. Well, right here we clearly have a bluff catcher, right? She's not leading with anything worse than top pair, medium kicker. But I could look and tell she was going to try to run some insane bluff. I pretty quickly put her all in for the last 1 or 2 big blinds, and she immediately folded. I mean, like, you could just look and tell, right? Like, the whole scenario is just lining it up. And these scenarios are few and far between, but they do come up. And when they come up, you need to make sure you're aware of them. But in general, you want to be overfolding against most people, because most people who go to play these big tournaments are not trying to bust themselves. They're going to try to enjoy their experience, right? And to be fair, in tournaments in general, you shouldn't really be trying to bust yourself, because you lose all future value extracting opportunities, right? So people get this, and a lot of people's natural tendencies is to do this. And for that reason, you should be overfolding in general, especially against their river bets. And especially as the bet gets bigger and bigger and risk a larger and larger portion of their stack, because, I mean, it takes a lot of fortitude to run an all-in bluff. I mean, just a lot of people aren't doing it. Some people will. I mean, I remember one on the bubble, and I don't forget what it was. I think a $3,000 buy-in tournament where I just had a good triple barrel spot. It was the bubble, and I didn't want to do it. It felt nasty, and my opponent eventually folded on the river. I don't know what they folded, but that one felt good to get through. But like, look, I mean, if I, Jonathan Little, who's ran plenty of river bluffs, feel dicey running this river bluff, a lot of people just wouldn't do it. You know, it takes a lot of courage to run triple barrel river bluffs, especially on the bubble when there's a decent amount of money on the line. Okay, number 2, you're going to generally want to underbluff the river when lots of draws miss and or when the board does not really change substantially. Because when the board does not change substantially, your opponent's marginal made hands, like middle pair, are going to be obviously decent. Also, when you bet the turn and the river, your opponents will usually assume that you're going to be pretty polarized. And when you are polarized, and there's a lot of busted draws, most people at this point in 2024 realize you have a lot of potential bluffs. Like, say, for example, you raise and the big blind calls and it comes 9-8-3 with 2 spades. You bet, they call. Say the turn's a 3. They check, you bet, they call. Say the river's a 2. The board did not really change, right? 9-8-3, 3-2. You probably don't have any 3s in your range. So when you're betting in this spot on the river, you're saying you have something like a good 9 or better, something like that. And the thing is that you could also have all the gut shots, all the open-ended straight draws, all the flush draws, all the random hands like King Jack that just decided to go for it. And your opponent's not going to fold a 9 here ever. They're just not going to do it. They're also probably not going to fold an 8 for second pair, right? Some people won't even fold ace high if they decided to get a little frisky. So this should result in you under bluffing in these scenarios. There are plenty of spots, even in GTO world, where you just don't bluff the river when you have a busted flush draw. because whenever you have a busted flush draw, it makes it less likely that your opponent has a busted flush draw because you're blocking some of them, right? So that makes those hands particularly bad hands to bluff on the river. A lot of people don't love the idea of betting the flop and the turn with whatever, queen high flush draw, and then just checking it back on the river. But you have to realize that if you take every busted draw on the river and you bluff with it, you're going to be drastically over bluffing when there are a lot of potential draws. Now, this is not necessarily true when there are relatively few draws available, because then you don't have very many draws to choose from to begin with, and you still have roughly the same number of value bets in most scenarios, like top pair, good kicker, and better. There's always going to be top pair, good kicker, and better on a lot of boards, and that results in bluffing in those spots being a little bit better. But especially when there's a flush draw and a straight draw, you have to be very careful when it comes to over bluffing, because people in 2024 realize there's a lot of bluffs available. And if there's a lot of bluffs available, they need to find some hero calls. And the thing is that if they are sitting there with a pair, a pair's pretty good when all the draws miss. So this will result in you under bluffing in spots like this. I know it feels bad just to give up, but unless you have a reason to go for the bluff, such as maybe your opponent looks like they were on a busted draw and they're bummed out about it, that they didn't get there on the river. Or maybe you have like the absolute worst busted draw. Like say on 9-8-2, you have 6-5 of spades. So 9-8 of spades with a 2, and you have 6-5. So you have the literal lowest bad end of the gut shot and the flush draw. So first off, the bad end of the gut shot doesn't really block many of their draws that would check call, like Jack 10 or Queen Jack for overcards, and the gut shots or open-ended. And the 6-5 of spades block the fewest number of spades because they're not going to call with whatever, Queen 5 of spades, perhaps, depending on their position. So the 6 and the 5 are sort of like the least relevant spades, whereas whenever you have the Queen of spades and the Jack of spades, you block the ones that they're a little bit more likely to have, because everyone always plays all of the good, strong, high Broadway hands. Okay. Next, you want to make a point to value bet thinly. Why? Because when you value bet thinly and your opponent's called with worse stuff, you are putting money in as a favorite, which is obviously good for you. This only backfires when your opponents raise adequately, both for value and as a bluff. And the great thing about poker in 2024 is that a lot of people are not raising nearly adequately enough for value and a bluff, especially as stacks start to get medium or shallow. They just check and call with their top pair good kicker that could raise. So when people raise you in general, they have just a very strong polarized range. So if their range is going to be strong and polarized, well, top pair's not actually, or middle pair, good kicker, top pair, bad kicker, etc., not actually in that good a shape. Okay, we're getting ahead of ourselves. So since most people don't raise often enough, when check two, you don't have to fear getting raised off your hand as often. Since you're not going to get raised off your hand as often, it's a little bit more free, let's call it, to value bet, because you're going to realize your equity. At the end of the day, poker is all about realizing your equity, and if you can realize your equity, you can extract value when you have it, right? For example, say you have middle pair good kicker. Middle pair good kicker is a pretty good hand to bet if your opponents will literally never raise you, because you probably have 55-ish% equity, or maybe even more against your opponent's range. So you're going to find that hands like middle pair are often good enough to keep betting on the turn if your opponents are rarely going to raise you. And top pair with a good kicker and better hands are usually good enough to value bet on the river. And that's going to be very, very true when the bet is non-all in. So like in the middle and early stages of the tournament, when you're 100 big blinds deep or something like that, definitely value bet hands like top pair. I actually had a spot I thought was close where I raised ace queen in middle position and the big blind called. A recreational player who I thought was tighter. We'll talk about this exploitatively a little bit. Flop came ace 9-6. He checked. I bet. He called. Turn was a 5, putting up 3 to a flush. I had ace queen of hearts, so I did not have the flush draw. He checked. I bet again. He called. River was a 10. Ace 9, 6, 5, 10. Okay. He checked. In GTO world, I looked it up. This is actually a value bet. The 10 did not complete the flush, or the 4 flush, obviously. And this felt kind of thin to me, right? That felt thin. If I think I'm ever going to get check raised, it's a disaster to bet in the spot. But if my opponent would have check raised all the flushes on the turn, then I really don't lose to many additional hands, right? I lose to literally ace 10 and 10-9, and that's about it. And I did not value bet for something like half-ish pot on the river. Don't go big in these spots. Whenever you do have top pair marginal kicker, you're often going for half pot value bet size. I did not value bet. It went check, check, and my opponent had queen 9. So they did have the middle pair. And I think this was a hand they actually should have called with if I value bet on the river, which is kind of neat. And I missed out on value. At least I didn't give myself the chance to potentially get value because I was worried that I may get raised. Now, exploitatively, I thought this particular opponent would not call river value bets thinly. I thought they were not going to call with stuff like queen 9, which is a hand that GTO recommends calling with. So I was mainly trying to get called by ace jack, ace 8, ace 7, and then the low ace X, right? So should I value bet there? Should I not? I don't know. I mean, if you do look at a solver output and you look at what the GTO solver should call with, and if your opponent will not call with some of those hands, then that should make you less inclined to value bet, right? And I think ace queen or ace jacks, one of those was like right at the bottom of the value betting range. So it's close is what it amounts to. That said, if your opponents will call off somewhat adequately, or maybe they're even a bit of a calling station on the river, and you know they're not going to check raise you with a random logical bluffing card, like say they had the random king of diamonds blocking the nuts, or the queen of diamonds in that scenario when there's 3 diamonds on the flop, maybe they check shove it on the river. That would have been miserable, and I would have had to fold, right? That would be a disaster, because when you let it go check, check, you just realize all of your equity. But if you're not going to get raised often enough, then that should result in you value betting way, 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 way thinner. Now, what comes from this is that when you do value bet and get raised, you should drastically overfold with your marginal made hands. So if you think that you are not going to be getting raised often enough, assuming your read is correct, which is, we are presuming that we are right more often than we are not, which, maybe it's true, maybe it isn't. But if you are right more often than you are not, when you do get raised, your opponents are going to have a logical raising range. And if everything we discussed so far is true, when they raise on the river, they're going to be heavily tilted towards value. So how does your hands, like, top pair, do against a river value raising range? Well, it's a bluff catcher. This is a marginal made hand at this point, given the action, and it's a bluff catcher. And since your opponent is not bluffing often enough, your bluff catchers should fold. And notice top pair marginal kicker, like ace queen in my example of ace 9, 6, 5, 10. Ace queen is a bluff catcher because no one's check raising ace jack for value. And if they are check raising ace jack, it's as some weird bluff. So since the opponent is probably not bluffing often enough, all of our bluff catchers become fold. Ace queen's a bluff catcher, so it's an easy fold. And a lot of people take this to mean that they should not value bet it to begin with, but you have to realize your opponents will call somewhat wide on the river. So you should value bet to extract value, right? When they do call. And when they do raise, which is probably going to be very infrequently, you're crushed. And that's okay. And you fold. Okay? Don't think that just because you can't bet and call a raise does not mean that you cannot value bet. But when you do bet the river, when someone raises you, unless you have a really good reason to think they're getting after it because they've been overly loose and overly aggressive and overly battly, you should just fold. Just fold. I mean, it sounds very exploitable, and to be fair, it is. If you just get to the river and every time you bet, when your opponent just raises you fold, you're going to get crushed in the long run if they are balanced. You make money when you overfold against someone who doesn't bluff often enough. That is a way to extract a lot of value. You just have to make sure you are actually extracting the value when you have the opportunities to make those thinnish value bets. Then finally, one play I've used very well so far at this WSOP, it is from out of position to use blocking bets, tiny bets, to induce raises from your overly loose, aggressive opponents. Now again, you need to make sure you have the right player for this. But from out of position, I think a lot of people are starting to understand when it goes check, check on the turn, the GTO strategy for the out of position player is to bet tiny with a range of mostly marginal made hands, usually stuff like middle pair, maybe top pair bad kicker, depending on the spot, sometimes second pair, sometimes third pair, it depends, but a pretty junky range for something like 1 or 2 big blinds. Sounds crazy. I think we've actually discussed this spot in either the tournament masterclass or the advanced tournament course. It is discussed in one of those, I know for sure. And when you bet that tiny bet, you are betting with something like 85% medium strength made hands, like, second pair, third pair, whatever. And then something like 10% super nuts, which a lot of people don't do. They don't include those in their range. They bet them big. And some bluffs. Also, a lot of people don't include any bluffs, or maybe they include a little bit. So you have a few total bluffs, a lot of medium strength hands, and a few super nuts. Many loose aggressive players will look at this and think, okay, you have a lot of medium strength hands that are not going to call a big raise. So you bet 1 or 2 big blinds into the 12 big blind pot, and they make it 20, thinking you're never going to call. So if that's the type of player you're against, you can almost count on them to have too many bluffs in the range, because these players do not like to fold for 1 big blind on the river or 2 big blinds on the river. This is something that they simply cannot do. They cannot give you the pot for a 1/10 or 1/12 or 1/6 pot bet on the river. It's against the way they think. And if they can't win by calling, because they're sitting there with 9 high or jack high or queen high, whatever, they're going to raise it. And this will result in them having far too many bluffs in their range, right? So if they're going to have too many bluffs in their range, all of your bluff catchers become profitable calls. And the great thing about this spot is that all the hands you're betting with to begin with, except for the tiny portion of bluffs, are going to be bluff catchers. They're going to classify because they're going to be a pair, right? So in GTO world, you're usually going to call the raise with a lot of your bluff catchers that block the effective nuts. So say there's 3 to a flush on the board. If you have the ace or the king or the queen or something like that of that suit that completes the flush, those are going to be calls with the middle pair in GTO world. If you block some sort of straight, those are going to be calls. So the ones that block the effective nuts pretty much always call, even in GTO world. And you're certainly going to want to call them in this spot too. But you're going to want to call even wider, really, because you have to realize you are presuming your opponents are going to over-raise because you know their range is wide. It's going to be difficult to defend, and you know they don't like to fold. So since they can't fold in their minds for 1 big blind, and they can't call with jack high, the only option in their brain becomes raise. And again, this presumes these loose aggressive players are willing to put in the raise. Some people will not. They'll just fold everything they can't win, and they'll call everything they can win, and they'll raise only very good hands. Against those weak, tight, straightforward players, you can use this tiny bet and then drastically overfold because they're not going to bluff you. But if you pinpoint your opponents correctly, this play will work wonders in resulting in your opponents drastically overbluffing. And if you know they're going to overbluff, you can then overcall. And you're going to scoop big pots with hands like second or third pair, which works out amazingly well. Now, of course, your good opponents are going to raise adequately with stuff like top pair, right? I actually had a hand in the 25K where I forget how it worked out, but I had like queen 9 on a 10-9 something board. And it was like 10-9, 6, 5, 4. And I bet tiny on the river, and the opponent raised. And I crying called. I looked it up in GTO world. It is a crying call. And my opponent showed up with pocket jacks. So they like check the turn with the jacks when the straight got there. And then I bet tiny on the river, and they went for value. A lot of players in the small stakes games would just call with pocket jacks there, fearing that I had random 2 pair. But this player realized most of my range to bet tiny should be a 9, maybe something like pocket 8s, maybe something like a 6. Remember, it was 10-9. I forget whatever the board was. They realized correctly that I'm going to have a lot of 9x there. And how does jacks do against 9x? Well, it absolutely crushes the range. So this player was good enough to realize that. He put in the raise, and I called, and I lost. I don't feel bad about it because I looked it up in GTO world, and it's still a fine call. But that's a raise a lot of people wouldn't make. They would just call, fearing the worst. They don't want to raise and then get re-raised. In the opponent's shoes, to be fair, if I bet tiny and he raised and I re-raised, he should probably fold, which is kind of cool. Because most people are not betting tiny and then re-raising. They just don't do it unless they have a really good hand. So anyway, all this is to say, you need to make sure you are exploiting the player you are against, because some of your opponents will be overly straightforward and some will be overly crazy. And you essentially want to do things that that play into the fact that the overly straightforward players typically play straightforwardly, like value betting thinly, right? What do they do wrong? They don't raise often enough as a bluff, or apply aggression as often as enough as they should as a bluff. Therefore, use lots of small amounts of aggression and realize your equity really well. What do loose aggressive battling players do incorrectly? Well, they bluff too often. Their ranges are too wide. So find spots where their ranges should be too wide and give them every possible opportunity to run a bluff, and then don't fold. That's a lot of what poker is when you're trying to play exploitative strategies. Exploitative strategies. There we go, I found it. Exploitative strategies. And in large field tournaments, that's going to be a lot of what your general strategy is, especially when you don't know your opponents and they seem to be a typical player in these fields. So that's it for today. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you have any questions, comments, suggestions, definitely let us know at support@pokercoaching.com. Thank you very much for being a member. I greatly appreciate it. If you're enjoying poker coaching, tell your friends. Good luck in your games. Have fun. And I'll talk to you next time.